Yeah, well, I think the evil-doing globalists that want a one-world totalitarian political, economic, and religious system are going to try to get a World War III wherever they can, however they can, if they have to drag us along kicking and screaming. And obviously, Russia, Ukraine is one potential hotspot that could very rapidly morph into a third world war. So is what's going on in the Middle East. Glad that things have cooled down a little bit between Iran and Israel, but that is a hotspot and it is continuing to fester. I don't think we're out of the woods there. Same thing with India and Pakistan. I was just in India a couple of weeks ago, or a couple months ago now. And I'll tell you, man, the Indians are ready to go to war with Pakistan. They're very, very upset about what's going on there. And a lot of the Pakistanis are upset with the Indians. So then you've got communist China and Taiwan. I think any of those could flare up at any time.
Welcome to Discourse with Christian. I'm your host, Christian White, and today is, of course, a returning guest, Alex Newman. Alex is the founder of Liberty Sentinel, and he is also a contributor to the Epoch Times. Alex, thanks so much for coming on the show again today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Christian.
Well, obviously, there's a lot going on in the world presently. Would love to start off kind of your current macro take on things. What are your latest thoughts?
Well, at the international level, big things are happening, right? The UN is now coming after us. They're saying we're not complying with all of their demands on education that our government at least has agreed to over the decades. That's very, very troubling. I've got a big article coming out in the print edition of the New American on this. Unfortunately, it hasn't gotten a lot of attention yet, but it's unbelievably significant. But even as that's playing out, we just got news that we are going to be withdrawing from UNESCO, the UN's education agency, which is very, very good news. It's a nice black eye for the globalists. And just a few days ago, we had Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announcing that we would be rejecting the UN WHO's international health regulations. Basically, they were planning to amend those to grant vast new powers to what I call the World Homicide Organization, the WHO, to basically do what they did to us during COVID, but with a veneer of legality. So we're not out of the woods yet on either of those fronts, but these are two of the most important mechanisms of the global establishment, right? The healthcare angle and the education angle to bring humanity under control. And just over the last week, both of those have been dealt a major blow by the U.S. government. Obviously, these are temporary victories. If we don't get these enshrined into federal law, the globalists will definitely be back. Next time we have a deep state Democrat or Republican puppet in the White House, they'll sign us right back up for these things. So we're not in the clear yet, but good momentum moving in the right direction. So that's exciting. So those are a couple of things I've been following. Obviously, the attack on educational liberty in the U.S. is ramping up. New Jersey lawmakers just introduced a bill that would actually require homeschoolers to teach the government's propaganda. You almost can't believe it, right? But they want the homeschoolers to have to line up their curriculum with what they call the New Jersey State Learning Standards. And these things are atrocious. I mean, they want to start sexualizing children in kindergarten, the global warming nonsense. And of course, less than 1 in 3 of the victims of their public school system are proficient in any core subject, reading, writing, math, history, science. And so now they want to force that on the homeschoolers who are actually doing a good job. So we're going to see a lot more attacks like that. The UN has actually said very openly that all education must be regulated and controlled by the government. That was one of their big criticisms of our system. So all these things are happening. But of course, we're not going to budge. We are not going to stop, and we got to keep exposing and opposing these people.
This thing that we're fighting as it relates to the education system is going on over in Europe as well and other parts of the West.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, it's global. Right? If you look at what the UN's agenda is when it comes to education, they have said it many times. In 1990, they came up with the Jomtien Declaration. Then in 2000, they met in Dakar in Senegal and came up with the next international education agreement where they said all children must learn from the same standards of learning and that these standards of learning need to be seen as a common and universal responsibility, which means a UN responsibility rather than parental responsibility, local government, even national government. You look in 1992 when they approved the UN Agenda 21 after the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. They said that education must change the attitudes, values, beliefs, and opinions of children. It's got to include spiritual education, they said, which means something very, very different than what Christian Americans might think. So they're just totally open about this agenda. We're seeing it most prominently, I guess, in Europe, where the sexualization, the lining up with the UN standards is happening in the open. But we're seeing the same thing in the United States. I mean, people who think that this has not impacted American education are just not paying attention. They haven't looked at what's going on here. And so this is a very serious battle. There's a lot of good groups fighting it. I'm a fellow at Classical Conversations, so we're doing what we can to push back on government control of private education and home education. There's a lot of organizations working to push back on this stuff. But unfortunately, these battles are really happening out of the public eye because most Americans don't even realize they're going on. If they knew, they would be outraged. But yeah, Europe is a hotbed of this stuff. The sexualization, the dumbing down. Really, Europe and the United States and Canada, along with Australia and New Zealand and some of those other countries, are the furthest along in terms of implementing these UN agendas in the classroom. But ultimately, the whole world is coming along with it. I was on the Arabian Peninsula a couple of years ago and was talking to folks from the Ministry of Education there in the United Arab Emirates, and they were proud that they're lining up their material with the UN. Now, they did express some reservations about the weird sex stuff. It's a very conservative Islamic government. They weren't enthusiastic about teaching their kids sodomy and transgenderism. But on all the other stuff, they were really excited that they were lining up their government curricula with what the UN is putting out. So it's a global phenomenon. And the UN actually has what they call, Christian, the World Core Curriculum. The guy who wrote it, the Assistant Secretary General of the UN, Robert Mueller, he said that every child in every school in every country needs to learn on the basis of this central global curriculum, the World Core Curriculum. And in the teacher's manual, in the forward to the teacher's manual, which I have, he admits that it's all based on the teachings of Alice Bailey, who was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. So when I say this stuff is diabolical, it's not a figure of speech or hyperbole. I mean, it's literally from the pit of hell. It's madness. And so I'm grateful that the Trump administration is now pushing back in a really concrete way.
So that Luciferian thing you just mentioned there reminds me of a lot of the stuff that I hear, and as I've, as I feel like you hear when you go further down the rabbit hole of the power structure, you hear about satanic stuff and pedo and all this other stuff. Would love to hear your thoughts as to kind of what's going on. I mean, what's founded, what's unfounded, and then obviously maybe we'll tailor that over to Epstein and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and when I read the Bible actually presents a pretty clear picture of this world. It is plagued by a number of enemies, right? The world system, the flesh, our sinful desires, and of course the devil himself, Satan, who is described by the Apostle Paul as the god of this world, the prince of the power of the air, a very, very powerful being. Now, we don't want to misunderstand that. Obviously, Satan's not God. He's not a legitimate counterpart or a rival to God. He's a created being whose end is going to be in the lake of fire. We know that. But he's got a lot of authority on this planet at the moment. And Paul actually tells us that he's blinded the minds of them which believe not. And so I'm always amazed when Christians are surprised to find out that there's evil at the highest levels of government and media and things like this. Did you read your Bible? Have you been reading the same Bible as I have? Because this is exactly what we should expect to find if the Bible is true. And the Bible's filled with references to this stuff. And Paul says in Ephesians 6:12, I mean, we're dealing not with flesh and blood here. Our battle's not with flesh and blood. It's not with people who've been deceived and enslaved by Satan and sin. Our battle's against powers and principalities, the rulers of the darkness of this world, spiritual wickedness in high places. So for me, even without knowing anything about current affairs, even without ever having heard the name Jeffrey Epstein, this is what we should have expected to find based on what the Bible tells us about the nature of reality in this fallen world. And so on that note, going over to Epstein, of course, the guy was a sex trafficking pervert who was trafficking children and using these sex videos to blackmail politicians. We all knew, or we should have known, that this kind of stuff was going on long before any of us ever even heard of Jeffrey Epstein. I knew it was going on, and so did almost everybody in Washington, D.C. And so this really should not be a surprise. What is a little bit surprising to me is that almost the whole country's talking about it now, which I think is a very, very positive and encouraging development. Step one for stopping this wickedness is exposing it, right? When people realize that this is the kind of stuff that's happening at the highest levels, that's what it will take to finally get people to stand up and say enough. But I was really disappointed with Donald Trump and some of the people around him with the response to this. I've heard people say he's playing 5D chess or 6D chess. I fail to see how demonizing your supporters about being concerned about a high-level child sex trafficker blackmailing high-ranking political media, law enforcement, judicial officials is bad. But here we are. That's very, very disappointing. I don't know what's going on with Trump. I don't know what's going on with some of the folks over at the FBI. Have talked to some of these people. I know that they at least used to share my concerns about these things. So my guess is that there are some people implicated who maybe are connected to the administration somehow, maybe helped in various ways to advance the agenda of the administration. I don't know the details, and that's probably a good thing because I would be telling everybody who would listen. But something really fishy is going on here, and I don't think that Trump supporters are going to be persuaded that, oh, well, the leader said we have to stop talking about it, so now we're going to stop talking about it. That's not going to fly. We're not Democrats. We're not sheep. Not in the biblical sense, but in the kind of sense of sheep for politicians and the media. And this is not a scandal that's going to go away.
It is interesting, some of the people who were at the forefront of trying to release these files, although I've heard from other people, why would you have a file where it's got all these curated lists? I mean, that's like so incriminating if you are, running this, if you will. But, Dan Bongino, Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, how there was, from my observation, very much a push to divulge and get into it. So clearly something very spooky was entered the scene, and that made them make an immediate about face as it relates to wanting to dive into that. So it's definitely an interesting topic.
Absolutely. And my guess is that there were some people implicated that would have caused a scandal so enormous and so tremendous that people would have struggled to wrap their head around it. My guess is probably some very high-ranking Republicans are implicated. My guess is some very high-ranking big tech CEOs are implicated. And of course, we know the tech bros have been gravitating now more toward MAGA, at least pretending to. And so, my guess is if the whole truth had come out, there would have been a serious dumpster fire, and it would have been hard to focus on other things. Now, I'm not saying that to justify it. I don't think it's justifiable to try to keep this information from us, but I think that is probably what is happening. There's been speculation that Trump may be involved somehow. I don't believe he's involved, but I gotta say that this looked pretty suspicious, right? But he was pushing for all this stuff a couple years ago, so I figure if he knew he was going to be implicated, he wouldn't have been at the forefront of demanding these things be released. And as for the idea that, well, they wouldn't keep a list of these types of things, one of the things that Jeffrey Epstein was doing was blackmailing people with the information that he had. So my guess is he had huge amounts of evidence. My guess is he probably had videos and archives and files with people from both parties, with people from major companies, with people from the judicial branch, engaged in things that they probably wouldn't want their wives or their local communities knowing about. And my guess is the DOJ has, or at least had, a lot of that information. Whether they still have it or not, that's a whole nother issue. We know that they are masters at getting rid of stuff. When Congress started figuring out about MK Ultra, the CIA's mind control operation, which absolutely involved pedophilia, sexual abuse of children, when Congress found out about this, they shredded the documents. And there were a few leftovers. We know they were force feeding LSD to mental patients. They were doing all kinds of terrible things that we know about. But most of those documents are gone forever. And could that have happened here? Absolutely. But then President Trump should have come out and said, hey, looks like somebody deleted the evidence. We're going to find out who it was. We're going to throw him in jail, and we're going to do what we can to recover that so we can let the American people know what happened here. But that's not what he's saying. So I know I'm not the only one who's very concerned, including people who are and have been very close to Trump over the years have expressed very serious concerns about this. I had General Flynn on my program just last week, almost incredulous that we were seeing this. And, very few people are more loyal to President Trump than General Michael Flynn. So the optics of this are really bad.
Yeah, it's as I am fortunate to bring on great guests such as yourself, and I learn more about the world, outside of mainstream media, if you will. It definitely shatters your take on governments and some of the nefarious things that they've done, especially these alphabet agencies that you hear so much about. And again, I feel like there's so much that would make your skin crawl if people were really aware of what's going on. I know we only have so much time together. So I also wanted to segue over to stuff that we hear a lot about in the news as it relates to the conflict over in Russia, Ukraine. I had Martin Armstrong on actually just a handful of days ago, and he was speculating based off his algorithm and things of that nature that things are, I guess, more or less supposed to escalate next month and into next year. Would love to hear your personal thoughts on that and where you see the puck going, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I think the evil-doing globalists that want a one-world totalitarian political, economic, and religious system are going to try to get a World War III wherever they can, however they can, if they have to drag us along kicking and screaming. And obviously, Russia, Ukraine is one potential hotspot that could very rapidly morph into a third world war. So is what's going on in the Middle East. Glad that things have cooled down a little bit between Iran and Israel, but that is a hot spot and it is continuing to fester. I don't think we're out of the woods there. Same thing with India and Pakistan. I was just in India a couple weeks ago, or a couple months ago now, and I'll tell you, man, the Indians are ready to go to war with Pakistan. They're very, very upset about what's going on there, and a lot of the Pakistanis are upset with the Indians. So then you've got communist China and Taiwan. I think any of those could flare up at any time. And we know the globalists love war. They use it as a pretext for undermining national sovereignty, for expanding the size and scope of government, for building up international institutions. They did it after World War I, trying to put the League of Nations on us. They did it after World War II by creating the UN, the European Coal and Steel Community that morphed into the European Union, the Bank for the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. All these institutions were born in the aftermath of catastrophic international wars. And the State Department understood this. They hired a guy back in the early 60s, Lincoln Bloomfield, to put together a report called World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. And in this report, he concluded that the fastest way to get to a world controlled by the United Nations, as the title of the report said, was to use war, the threat of war, and crises to change national attitudes and accelerate this process of globalization. So I think there's a very real prospect that any of these conflicts could flare up into something catastrophic that might even involve the use of nuclear bombs, might even involve the use of electromagnetic pulse attacks to take out power grids. And so I think all that is a very real possibility. And I think you could combine that with several other major crises at the same time, and you'd end up with what the World Economic Forum described as a poly-crisis, where you have, the war, you've got the economic crisis, you've got maybe a public health scare or some sort of environmental disaster, all materializing at similar times and culminating in this giant poly-crisis that would lead to almost inevitably calls for totalitarian controls to save us from the problems that these maniacs are unleashing on us.
As it relates to the globalists, I've been asking guests lately. For those who've been following the show, I'm always curious by people's take on the power structure. Who would you say, or what groups are behind the globalists in your own words?
Well, I think, and I just wrote a book about this a few years ago called Deep State, the Invisible Government Behind the Scenes. We've got a second edition in the works right now, hoping to have that out in the next few months. But I think the first and most important thing to understand is the Deep State, the evildoers, the cabal, whatever you want to call it, has a commander-in-chief, and his name is Satan, right? I alluded to that just a little while ago. The Bible makes very clear that what we're up against here is a satanic force. It's not just people with bad ideas. It's not well-intentioned bureaucrats who just have dumb ideas. These are evil forces. And when you get down from there, one level, I think you've got what we just described in Ephesians 6:12. Paul talks about the powers, principalities, the spiritual wickedness and darkness in high places. So the spiritual entities, demonic forces that unfortunately have been around for a very long time. And the Bible doesn't speak too terribly much about them, but they're mentioned multiple times in the Old Testament. Daniel chapter 10 has some very clear allusions to these spiritual forces that kind of govern nations. And from there, one step down, you've got human organizations, and there's a lot of those. I focus in on 6 or 7 of them in my book. The Bilderberg Group is, I think, very important. The Council on Foreign Relations is very important. The Trilateral Commission, very important. You've got some secret societies, things like Skull and Bones at Yale University. You've got the Bohemian Grove out in Northern California. These are all very important organizations, some of them secret, some of them kind of semi-secret, but all moving the world inexorably toward a one-world totalitarian system. And so what we see is a lot of useful idiots get roped into these movements, but at the highest levels, you've got, I think, really a small core of people who are consciously dedicated to this evil agenda. And I think some of those organizations that I just mentioned should be, key focal points in terms of looking at who are the people who are driving these changes.
Dave Cullen was the first one of the first guests I had on to kind of introduce me to this stuff, and it seems kind of out there. I mean, I wouldn't consider myself, like super religious per se, but I'd be lying if I am not more in religious in a sense, because there definitely is a nefarious component there, whether people will look at it from a religious sense or otherwise. I was watching a video by a former Dutch banker who, according to him, he was in this world. I think his name was Ronald Bernard or something like that. But it's amazing, Alex, how many videos or testimony of people who've partaken in things and stuff. And again, it sounds out there in la la land a little bit to like your average person, but when you kind of dive into it, you realize that okay, there definitely is some element of this going on. What are some other things that perhaps you're tracking, or things that might come as a surprise to viewers?
Well, and in the book, I do include a lot of evidence about these organizations, because I recognize what you're saying. For a lot of people who aren't exposed to this information, it does seem pretty incredible. But you can piece together the facts about these from a lot of primary source documents. In terms of these secret organizations and what they're up to. In many cases, you can use their own documents. So I would encourage people to verify that and to look it up and to check out this information yourself. Because what you'll find once you dig into it is that there really are wicked people who have nefarious plans for your life, and they work together in secret. And people have an innate understanding that happens like at the local level, like, oh yeah, of course, powerful local businessmen conspire against us to steer government contracts to each other and things like that. That's fine. But when you get to higher levels, suddenly they're all supposed to be these angelic, well-intentioned people, and I think that's self-evidently ludicrous. So I would encourage people to do some of their own digging on this and look it up. In terms of other stories that we are following, one of the big ones is what's coming up with the climate summit. The UN, I try to go to these every year. The climate scam, as I call it, is really one of the most fundamental justifications for the whole system of global tyranny that they're building. And to kind of put it very succinctly, they're trying to convince people, and they know they're not going to convince us, but they're trying to convince the kids in the schools that the gas they exhale is a toxic pollution, and that somehow paying taxes to the UN over this toxic pollution is going to make the weather better in 100 years. And I mean, it sounds so incredibly stupid, but a kindergarten child doesn't know any better, right? I mean, they're in kindergarten. They trust the teacher. So you don't hear about this as much in the United States anymore, because they know that the polling data shows clearly most Americans don't believe this silliness. So they're focusing on the children. But what I like to do every year is I go to these UN conferences where they're dealing with this. This year's is going to be in Brazil. I'm actually just sending in my application today to get to this one. I was in Azerbaijan last year for the one then. I was in on the United Arab Emirates the year before that, and in Egypt the year before that. So I try to go to these every year to follow what they're doing. And there's a political, there's an economic, and there's a religious component, and I've focused on all three of those. The political component is, of course, they want a one world government to, they say global problems require global solutions, and well, this is a global problem, so global solutions have to come from the UN. The economic component is hugely significant. They're trying to rearrange the entire economic structure of the world. Move it away from what's left of the free market toward kind of like a resource-based economy where your carbon footprint will determine how much you're allowed to consume. Sounds pretty crazy, because it is, but it's what they're working on, and it's very easy to document. And then the religious component is one that I have focused in on quite a bit as well. They're bringing all the religions of the world together to kind of reframe sin, reframe morality. And this is becoming increasingly obvious over the years. Just a couple of years ago, when we were in Egypt for the climate summit there, they had this weird ritual where a whole bunch of these religious leaders of the world walked up to the top of Mount Sinai, which is where God delivered the Ten Commandments to Moses. And they unveiled the new and supposedly improved 10 Commandments, which instead of like, don't murder, don't steal, don't lie, don't commit adultery, it was like, oh, we have to feel the cries of Mother Earth, and all this weird pagan, pantheistic gobbledygook about really worshiping Mother Earth, worshiping the creation. So what we're seeing here is an effort to hijack religion, to weaponize religion against God, against the truth, against individual liberty, against family, against nations. And it's very far advanced. People don't realize. A lot of people are in churches right now. They don't realize their churches have already hitched their wagon to this international movement. Lots of the Protestant churches, obviously the Catholic Church, lots of the Orthodox churches, they're all moving along with this movement. And they say so openly. So, folks, the climate hoax, even though you're not hearing about it much, is hugely significant. I just did another big article in the New American earlier this year about a global tax that this will be the first global tax in the history of humanity paid directly to the UN. This was approved in April at a meeting in London by the International Maritime Organization, and it's going to start at pretty small. They said they might raise $100 billion a year by 2027 by taxing the emissions of these international ships that take goods and services across the oceans. But that's just the camel's nose under the tent. At the same time, you've got the UN World Court, they call it the International Court of Justice, preparing a ruling as we speak on what they call the legal obligations of states with respect to climate change. And they will conclude, I can almost guarantee it, that every government in the world has an obligation to regulate carbon dioxide emissions, which, by the way, everything you do produces CO2 emissions, including breathing, and to limit those and to control human activity under the guise of controlling CO2. So this is, it's hard to overstate the danger of this to the future of humanity, the future of liberty. And I just hope people will pay attention. You're not going to get the facts by watching the fake media, but turn off your TV, quit reading the fake newspaper, and find good sources of information, because these are the things that are important that are actually happening, and these are the things that they're trying to distract you from with their celebrity scandal or whatever foolish thing is in the news. Recognize that the really important things are the things that are not being talked about, and that's why they're not being talked about. They know that if you knew, you'd be doing something about it.
Absolutely. I was sharing with a buddy how it's, when you go on Instagram or you go on social media or things of that nature, they'll have the most sexual stuff on there. They'll have things that are outright deviant and just mindless videos and such. But yet, if you want to talk about something that challenges the narrative and such, yeah, you'll get canceled. I mean, I think about that too when I as I continued. This is like my 93rd episode. I think about, well, do I want to stay vanilla and stay in this little box, or do I want to just kind of lean more into, my authentic self and what I find interesting and the guests that I want to have on? And I'd rather choose that if it means, getting deplatformed at some point in time. But yeah, the current state of affairs, again, I know we only have a few more minutes, but a few other quick questions. Civil strife over in the West, where do you see that? Do you see things breaking out later this year, or?
Yeah, I think we're going to see an acceleration of the unrest and the violence that is being very carefully engineered. And I've seen this coming for a long time. I've been warning about it for years. I actually believe they want to provoke a civil war in this country. During Trump's first term, you had Rich Higgins, who was the director of policy and planning on the National Security Council, warning about a Maoist-style insurgency. He talked about how there was a growing alliance between jihadists, Muslims, the LGBT movement, the socialists, the globalists, the Islamists, all converging. And he said they were united in their goal of destroying the United States of America, not just as a nation, but as an ideal. And I think that's actually one of the reasons they brought millions of illegal immigrants here over the last few years, is to help fracture national unity and cohesiveness, try to balkanize the United States into different warring, ethnic and religious factions. They need to bring down the United States to move toward this new world order that they're constantly talking about. And as Rich Higgins explained in this memo, it's not enough to just destroy the country, right? You have to discredit the ideas that it was based on, the ideas of our founding fathers enshrined in our Declaration of Independence, that God created us equally, that God gave us rights that are above governments, and the governments are instituted to protect these rights. You can't have people believing these ideas and also being good subjects of the global system they're trying to build. They're just not compatible with each other. And so I think we're going to see more and more left-wing violence in this country. We may see false flag attacks. We may see foreign operators on American soil, special forces, terrorist organizations knocking out critical infrastructure. And I would encourage Americans to stay vigilant. Assuming you have a good sheriff, a good law enforcement community in your community, be ready to assist them and support them if things get crazy. But get involved now while we still have the opportunity to push back on this evil.
And then lastly, as it relates to Tulsi Gabbard's or what she's put out there as it relates to Obama and Russiagate and such, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
We've known about this for a long time. It is treason. It is criminal activity at the highest levels. These people should all be arrested and prosecuted. If I was at DOJ, I'd offer a lot of them immunity in exchange for testimony against the higher up. We don't want to just allow some low-level minions to fall on their swords and say, "Oh, that's it. Everybody who was responsible is now being held accountable." Baloney. We need to go to the highest level and find, just like when you're doing, a drug case or a gang case, you don't want the little guy who stands on the street corner and sells nickel bags. You want the big cheese at the top of the pyramid. And so I would offer immunity to all these lower level people until we start getting testimony against the really high level players. And these people need to absolutely be prosecuted and held accountable to the fullest extent of the law.
Alex, as always, always a pleasure to have you on and to hear your thoughts. How can people learn more about you and get in touch with you?
Thank you, Christian. So my website, libertysentinel.org, we have a free newsletter people can sign up for there. Comes out 2 or 3 times a week. I'm senior editor at the New American magazine. People can check that out at thenewamerican.com. I encourage people to subscribe. And then I'm a senior fellow at Classical Conversations. So if you have children or children in your life that you love and are looking for a good homeschool program where you've got a community to meet with in person, check it out, classicalconversations.org and .com. Really, really great program. And thank you again for having me, Christian. Always a pleasure.
Likewise, and looking forward to having you on here again soon.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, sir.
All right, you too. Take care. Quick ask. Over half of you who watch the show regularly haven't yet subscribed. If you've enjoyed the show, you're finding value in it, subscribing is really the best way to support the channel. It's, of course, free. It literally takes 2 seconds, and it lets the algorithm know that this content matters. And, of course, my commitment to you is going to be that I'm going to continue to bring on great guests, refine those questions. And of course, I'm always receptive to your feedback. If there's certain people that you'd like to have on, or certain questions, or this, that, and the other that you'd like to have as part of the show going forward, things of that nature, please let me know. I'm pretty easy to access. Anyhow, that's my commitment to you. If you can subscribe, that would mean a lot. Thanks.